second language. So if I'm going too fast, then make a hand gesture at me of your choosing, and I will slow down. So we come at climate change from the perspective that you're not going to solve climate change unless we build a more just economy and a more just society and a more just world. And I was going to start, if I was more organized, with a little picture on the PowerPoint, which is a cartoon that maybe you've seen, which is some people saying, you know, what if we do all these things we're supposed to do to solve climate change, like reduce inequality and reduce poverty and have all this sustainable development, and then climate change doesn't even exist? You know, like we'll have wasted our time. And I wanted to show that because I think the point is that when we're talking about climate change, we sometimes spend all of our time arguing against people who don't think it even exists, and less time thinking the things that we should be doing to combat climate change is exactly the kind of things that we should be doing anyway, because it's causing massive suffering in the world, even if climate change didn't exist. So this economy that we live in, which is completely driven by the market knows best, just leave the market alone and it will sort everything out. It will bring food to the hungry and medicine to the sick, and it will create a perfect environment. And just leave all these big businesses alone and they'll regulate themselves and work out what the best thing to do is. And don't worry about any democracy getting in the way of any of this, because your democracy is exercised through you spending your money. Those choices, that's your democracy. This whole economic system is exactly the main thing that's driving the climate to the brink of not being able to sustain us as people anymore. And there's this famous saying that people talk about a lot, which is this economy and the way that it works has got so into our minds, so into our imaginations, that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Okay, so changing this economic system seems like more difficult, more impossible, more improbable than us just dying in some cataclysm caused by climate change. And I think that's a really important starting point, because one of the things that I find really frustrating is the way that too often we're given supposed solutions to the climate catastrophe which don't seem in any way commensurate with the scale of the problem. So we're told we need to recycle more paper, we're told we need to put light bulbs in that are more efficient and are going to be burning less fossil fuels, we're told that we need to fly less. I mean, I'm not against any of these things are all fine, but they don't really seem, even if we all do it and we'll put this stuff together, they don't really seem capable of dealing with the enormous catastrophe that we're facing as a civilization. And that's because I think these things seem very safe. They seem compatible with the status quo. They don't challenge any vested interests. We just sit back and we wait for more technology. And then everything can stay the same and we'll also be able to save the planet. And so what I want to argue is we need to do more than that. We definitely need to challenge our economic system. We definitely need to challenge the powerful in the world. We definitely need to challenge big business. And as I say, we would need to do that whether climate change existed or not. And in some ways, as Naomi Klein says, for those who've read her book or seen her film, I know some of us are going to be watching it on Saturday, actually climate change is the biggest wake-up call that civilization could have, that we as people could have, and the best way that we can go out and convince many people in our society that we actually need a fairer and more just and more democratic world anyway. The market, the rule of the market, which we've had, you know, on and off to a greater or lesser extent for 200 years, has certainly created amazing things. But the things it's created have by and large profited a very small minority of the world's population. And it's often said that the market will create stability and it will give people all the basic stuff that they need. And as I say, it's given that to the richest, but for the majority it hasn't provided that for the majority of the world's population. And particularly in very serious situations, the market has proven to be an absolute disaster at providing the basic things people need to live. And I know this because it was my country that forced the market onto countries like India in the 19th century and essentially stood by while millions of people starved to death, even though there was enough food in India for people to eat if it had been distributed fairly and properly. But simply because they could not afford that food, they were not able to eat, and they starved. And that was what the market brought to people 150 years ago. And I very much fear it's a similar situation that the market will create as we face another extremely serious existential crisis, and that's climate change. So let me start with what we can expect from the politicians, our leaders, who are going to go to COP in 3 or 4 weeks' time to negotiate the kind of climate deal that we all need. And I want to first of all say, this is just a symptom of the problem, really. But I don't know if people have looked at the companies that are sponsoring the COP, that are actually paying for it to happen. You might be interested. Air France is one of them. So the main sponsor is an airline company. There's Renault, the car company. There's Suez, which is a water and waste company. It's also a very key member of the pro-fracking lobby in France. There's BNP Paribas, which is a bank which supports coal mining. And there's Moët Hennessy, which makes champagne and brandy and other things like that. So it's not directly contributing to climate change like the others, but it is a well-known tax dodger, and it is selling the kind of luxury products that are fueling unsustainable lives, that are a real symptom of this economy, which is causing climate change. So, you know, as I say, it's just a symptom, but it's pretty worrying. And we know from previous COPs that when we get there, the whole place is going to be flooded with corporate lobbyists, corporate side meetings and so on, offering their solutions to climate change, which are absolutely at odds with building the kind of alternative economy that we want. But beyond the sponsors, I want to look at what our governments are pushing in terms of their own economic policies. Because I think, you know, I'm sure all of our political leaders are talking at the moment about, you know, we need to tackle climate change and we need to go and make sure there's a really good deal. You know, I know certainly Obama and John Kerry are talking about this in the US. We need to go to Paris to make sure there's a deal. But I want to look at some of the other things they're pushing so we can work out whether these things are actually compatible with dealing with climate change. One of our big campaigns, I know one of the big campaigns for you as well, is TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. TTIP is one of 4 massive trade deals that's being negotiated at the moment. And it's really less to do with trade, i.e. it's less to do with me selling you bananas and you selling me coffee, than it's to do with rewriting the rules of the global economy, and rewriting the rules of the global economy in favor of corporations, in favor of capital, and to the detriment of us as citizens. But the specific things in TTIP that are desperately worrying in terms of the fight against climate change. And the first one of those is called the Energy Chapter. The European Union is pushing the Energy Chapter very hard, much harder than the Americans. So let's not imagine this is all about the Americans and their terrible standards coming over here. The European Commission is pushing very hard this thing called the Energy Chapter, which will create a free trade zone in energy products across the European Union and the United States. There's a similar deal you probably know about as well called CETA, which is a Canada-EU deal. That's a little bit further advanced than TTIP, but it has the same kind of provisions in it, and that also has energy provisions in it. What's this going to mean? Essentially, and they're a little bit skeptical about telling us in Western Europe this, but in Eastern Europe, they're going very big in terms of selling TTIP on the idea that TTIP is all about reducing our dependence on Russian fossil fuels, Russian gas, and replacing that with a dependence on American fossil fuels, particularly fracked gas. Obviously, there's been a complete revolution in fracked gas in America. And in the case of Canada, tar sands oil, some of the most poisonous fossil fuels in the world. So centrally for the European Union, TTIP is about energy, and it's absolutely about allowing that fracked gas and those tar sands to flow into Europe more easily. And of course that's going to increase the production of these things, because if America can sell more of it into Europe, they're going to stop fracking more, and more tar sands will also be produced. So something right there at the center of TTIP, which is a complete disaster for climate change. As a matter of fact, And obviously we don't even have TTIP signed yet, but just as a result of the negotiations on TTIP and CETA, the European Union has already watered down its standards on tar sands oil. It was going to create this regulation that was going to make it quite difficult to import tar sands, because they were going to say it's got, you know, it's much more toxic than normal oil. And the TTIP and the CETA negotiators from Canada and America said, we really don't like this. You know, if we're going to be negotiating free trade deals with you, we can't have that kind of regulation. And the EU has dropped completely that regulation, and now tar sands oil is just dealt with like any other oil, regardless of its carbon emissions. And that's before the thing's even been signed and ratified. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, I'm sure you know about this, so I won't go on about it at length, is this horrible, what we call corporate court system. The Investor State Dispute Settlement System, ISDS, which will allow American corporations to sue our governments, and vice versa, for bringing in regulations that companies don't like because they damage their profits. And I've just been on a tour of Britain with somebody from Canada called Maud Barlow. She's from our sister organisation, the Council for Canadians. They've been fighting hard against CETA. And the thing that she's been telling audiences all around Britain is, look at Canada, because we already have this. We signed the North American Free Trade Agreement 20 years ago, and we are now the most sued country in the world, and almost everything that we've been sued on is environmental regulations that we've tried to pass by American multinational corporations. We've been sued for prohibiting fracking. We've been sued for trying to take cancer-causing chemicals out of...
What's fracking?
Fracking is a method of is there a word for it?
Yeah, Schiefergas. Shale gas.
Okay.
Yeah, do you know it now? It's a way of like fracture. It's a gas that's trapped in rocks, and it's a way of kind of fracturing the rocks to get this gas out. So it's gas that's not very easily accessible to us, and it causes a lot of environmental damage, just the process of getting this stuff out. And one state in Canada put a prohibition on it. They didn't even ban it completely. They just said, we need to do more research. Let's not do anything else until we've done the research. And they're being sued for that. They're being sued for taking poisonous chemicals out of petrol. They actually reversed the decision after they were sued for that. They've been sued for stopping mines. They've been sued for stopping quarries, all manner of things. There's no question if TTIP gets passed, those kind of cases will be brought against our governments here in Europe by those multinationals.
Was that this is CETA or?
So this is Canada has been sued under NAFTA.
NAFTA.
Yeah, so these cases have been brought under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is a 20-year-old free trade agreement, but gives us an idea, because it's got similar provisions, of what TTIP and CETA will mean if it comes here.
Could you say that a bit slower? CETA and TTIP,
Because of all the acronyms. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
What were they called?
TTIP, TTIP.
Okay.
And then CETA is CETA. But it's as easy to think of them as the US-Europe deal and the Canada-EU deal. And at the heart of them, they're deregulation treaties. They're treaties to essentially, well, we call it harmonizing our standards. That sounds very nice. Who doesn't want to harmonize our standards? But actually, it will mean lowering of our standards. It will mean a race to the bottom. And one of the big things that American agribusiness wants is particularly that we accept in Europe a lower standard of food production, which means don't worry too much about the animals' welfare and the animals' health while they're alive and through the killing and processing of the animals to turn them into meat. It says just cut out all of the unnecessary steps, dunk them in some chemicals at the end to get rid of the bacteria, and that's easier and more profitable. And American agribusiness has been very, very clear. It's on the record as saying, you know, you Europeans, you just need to get real about the food you eat, because we eat it in America and it's perfectly fine. They've actually said that. So this is about, and of course the kind of intensive farming that's commonly practiced in America is a major contributor to climate change, a major contributor to carbon emissions. So we want less of that, not more of it. So it's difficult to imagine that the same people who are pushing through trade agreements like TTIP are going to come to the kind of deal that we want in Paris. And another thing that I wanted to mention is austerity. Austerity is the watchword in Europe at the moment. And it's interesting because I think when a lot of people think about the things we need to do to deal with climate change, they kind of think, yeah, we need a lot of austerity. But actually...
I think maybe austerity, can you explain that?
Austerity is essentially the kind of cuts to public spending and the deregulation that's being especially forced on countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, but I mean also we have it in Britain, and I'm guessing you have some of it here too. It's the kind of economic policy of our times after the financial crash. And a lot of people think, well, that's what we need to do, isn't it? To deal with climate change, we need to stop consuming so much. We need to cut. But actually, austerity policies are very different from that. Because what they're doing, and you can see it most blatantly in countries like Greece, is allowing the very richest to keep consuming. Actually, the richest have got richer since the financial crisis 8 years ago. And what it means is that the poorest can't afford the basics, and especially because public services are being cut back. That's the opposite of what we need to deal with climate change. We need less luxury consumption and more low-carbon public services, decent transport systems, decent well-insulated housing, and that kind of thing. It's really interesting. One of the first things that the Greek government was told to cut when it went into its debt crisis was the railway link with the rest of Europe. So you can't take a train to Greece anymore because there's no European link. It was the first thing they cut. And what are they doing now? Privatizing all of the airports in the country. So 14 regional airports on islands and so on in Greece have been sold to a German company, and the German company is going to come in and run them more productively, which means more flights coming into Greece. So more high carbon travel, less low carbon travel is what austerity's meant, just in the case of Greece. It's also selling off its oil companies, its gas companies, these kind of things, so that they can be run more efficiently. And even some of the things that, you know, sound like really good, like aid, like the aid that we send to the developing world. The British government is using our aid budget at the moment to help big agribusiness corporations go into Africa and farm land on a bigger scale more efficiently, with the idea that this will produce more food. So they're working with Nestle, they're working with Coca-Cola, they're working with Monsanto in order to help feed Africans by producing food on a bigger scale with more chemicals. And of course, much of that food will actually be for export. So again, it's a disaster in terms of climate change. More carbon-intensive farming, less food for people who actually live in an area, and more food to be exported with all the miles that entails. So I say all of this as a way of saying it's very difficult for me to believe that the politicians who are pushing all of these policies are suddenly going to turn around in Paris and say, oh, no, let's forget all of that. Let's actually start introducing and implementing some policies which will be good for the planet as well as people in it. And what they do, instead of talking about the real structural policies that we need to solve climate change, they start making up all sorts of concepts that look like they're a really good idea, that look like they're going to be good for the environment, but are actually not. And my favourite one of these, which my government is very, very happy about and is pushing, is called biodiversity offsetting. Has anyone heard of it? Has anyone heard of natural capital? You've heard of it. Carbon markets. Do you know about carbon markets? So carbon markets are a slightly older example. You put a price on carbon. You put a price on carbon emissions. And the idea is, well, that will make it more expensive to pollute, to burn carbon. So it will make it less likely that people will do it because they have to pay more for it. The whole thing has been a disaster. The market has nearly collapsed. And as a matter of fact, fossil fuel companies earned money under carbon markets for polluting because the price was so low. So now what they're doing is they're saying, let's go beyond carbon markets. Let's put a price on everything in nature, everything in the natural world. So that's natural capital. Everything has a price. It's the same logic. So it may be a species, wildlife, it may be a lake, it may be a forest. It's all got a price. So the idea is Rio Tinto, the mining company, can go and open a mine in Bolivia That's okay, you can do that if you can pay for it. But part of the price includes an offset, a biodiversity offset, which goes to another project, probably a long way away in Africa or something, where they grow a forest or something. Yeah, they plant a forest. I still don't understand how, if you wipe out a species, you can create another species somewhere else. No one's explained that to me. But anyway, the idea is you can offset any damage you do. A bit like in the Middle Ages, if you sinned, you could go to a priest and you could buy an indulgence, and then you could that was okay. So it's like buying a kind of indulgence for multinational corporations. And this is going to be an absolute disaster. First of all, because it doesn't stop people doing bad things. It just means there's a price attached to it. And the idea is, I went to a conference where someone was actually explaining this. I think he was the head of Puma, you know, the trainer that makes the trainers and the sports gear. And he said, oh, you know, I'm often asked by my friends, well, Mike, or whatever his name was, Mike, you travel around the world a lot, you fly a lot. How do you deal with that? Because you're always talking to us about climate change. And he says, well, I don't really have a problem with it because I do so much good that I have a net positive impact on the world. Right? So this is the idea. You need a net positive impact. Doesn't matter how much bad you do, just do a little bit more good. The second, so obviously it's fine to do all of this stuff. So the second problem is even the good stuff is usually not very good. What it often means is taking a bit of land in Africa, moving the people off it, planting a monoculture crop to soak up the carbon, and that's the good thing. And we know of stories where people have even been thrown off their land at gunpoint to create these wonderful good things. I often think actually, you know, for groups like ours, I mean, maybe we shouldn't have bothered trying to fight human rights abuses for so long. You know, let all the dictators in Latin America in the 1970s put people in prison, torture people, kill people, and they can buy a permit to offset it, and then somewhere else we can use that permit to set up an amnesty office or something like that. So the dictators are having a net positive impact on the world. That's how absurd this stuff is. But it really is being talked about. And the most worrying thing, I think, beyond the practicalities, the most worrying thing is that the reason we're burning the planet is because we already think about everything as if it was a market. We already think about the whole of our society as if it was just so many commodities. And we're just isolated consumers buying, you know, trying to maximize our self-interest. And this idea turns even more stuff, even more of our world into a commodity, into a theoretical market. And I think one of the problems that we've got is the rule of the market, the ideology of the market has been going for so long and is so powerful, it's even got inside our heads. So even in our heads we have a kind of a mentality of the market. So I go around and talk to people at universities quite a lot, and you go and talk to first years at universities now, and you say, well, why are you here? And they say, well, I'm here to get a better paying job when I leave. Everybody says that. Now, I wasn't at university too long ago, but when I was at university, nobody would have said they were at university to get a better paying job. Even, some people might have thought it, but they wouldn't have dared to say it. It would have been an embarrassing thing to say. I worry that people say that because our whole minds are now like a market. I've invested in going to university. I've taken out a debt, so I need a return on that. My life is an investment account. So I need a better paying job. Not a job I enjoy, not a job that's useful socially, but a better paying job because it's a return on my investment. And I think it's started closing off our imagination. Just as our world is being enclosed. Do you have this term enclosure for... in the Middle Ages in England, we used to have something called the commons, where land was owned not privately, but there was land that was owned that peasants could go and use for they could get food, they could graze their animals, they could get firewood, all this kind of stuff. And it was like a social security net for the Middle Ages. And then when the Industrial Revolution happened and capitalism started, the landlords threw all the peasants off the land and they enclosed it with fences. So it's called enclosure. And I think our world, I think all the privatizations that we're seeing around the world now, they're like enclosures too. Our health services, our education systems, they're being enclosed. But I think in some ways our imagination is being enclosed as well in the same way and turned into. So the first thing we've got to do, I think, is reclaim that, is begin to dream again, begin to think big again about how society could be different. You know, the idea that 8 years after banks brought Europe to the brink of catastrophe in economic terms, you can create a financial market in nature and that's going to solve the climate crisis is crazy. You know, I don't even know many people who think banks should be run like banks, never mind running the environment as if it were a bank. You know, but this is accepted in political discourse, and we've got to be able to open our minds to dream bigger and to challenge that. And I suppose that's the first thing I'd say when we come on to why should we go to Paris. I think we should go to Paris not with the expectation that our political leaders are going to make a deal that we can all be proud of and go home and say, great, our job is done. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to sign a deal which is, at best, they're going to sign a deal which is kind of like, yeah, in about 100 years, we might have got to the stage where we won't have any more carbon emissions, we won't have any more fossil fuels. Well, that's too late. But I think we've got to go there because we've got to, first of all, hold them to account. First of all, say to them, this is absolutely not acceptable, and you don't do this in our name. Secondly, we've got to go there to give other people in the world who aren't there, and ourselves, some hope. Because what we want to do, and I know we're going to discuss this in one of the working groups afterwards, of course we're going to have a big demonstration beforehand in London, you're probably having one here too, but what we really want to do is have a big demonstration at the end, in the expectation that there will not be a good deal. At the end we are going to turn our backs on world leaders and say, okay, you failed us, you failed the people of this planet, we are going to create something different, we are going to tackle the climate crisis. And so I hope anyone who is going, you'll be there at the end, because I think that's going to be a really special moment where we don't get down and depressed and say, no, everything is hopeless, but we say, you failed us and this is up to us now. And it's up to a new generation of people to do this. And also because I think it's going to be a fantastic moment to share with other activists from across the world, to share, to learn, to debate, and to begin to open up our minds to new ways of thinking, to bigger ways of thinking, to different ways of thinking outside of the market, outside of the way that we're told is the only possible way of doing things. And I want to end by saying just a little bit of how we're approaching next year, because I think we've got to already think beyond Paris. One of my worries when we started talking about climate change was that in some ways we'd be repeating what many of us experienced here in Copenhagen at the last really big COP, where we said there's 2 weeks to save the world. There's 2 weeks to save the world. You've got to get active now. We need millions of people to sign it. We need to put pressure on. And then it didn't happen. So then what are you supposed to say? Okay, we haven't saved the world then. That's bad. We'll go and watch TV for the rest of our lives to try and forget that we haven't saved the world. Right? We don't want to tell people that when we're going to Paris. We don't want to pretend to people. We want to be honest with people. This is a really long-term struggle, but it's an important staging post. And what we're going to do next year is go on from Paris and say, we use this as one point in building our movement for a different world. Our movement that can rid us of this market mentality, that can start dismantling the power of big business and allow us to reclaim our democracy and build a more equal world. And the first thing is, I think, yeah, we've got to oppose this free market fanaticism. And we're already involved in this. I imagine you're all involved in this kind of stuff. So let's stop TTIP. Let's stop the free trade agreements. And I really believe we can do that. I really believe we can stop TTIP. I mean, I don't know what the movement's been like here, but in Britain it's just taken me completely by surprise. 18 months ago we started working on this. Nobody knew what this word meant. We'd go and talk to parliamentarians, we'd go and talk to the media, and they was, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. This isn't happening. And now we have groups all over the country making one hell of a noise that the European Commission never thought it was going to hear over this dry technical deal. So we've already started, and I think we can do it. And I don't know, a few of you may be old enough to remember, back in the mid-1990s, a very similar agreement was being discussed. It was called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. We heard about it. We got in contact with organizations like ourselves around the world, and we defeated it in 2 years. It was pretty similar to TTIP. We defeated it. And once we defeated it, people in our society started questioning, actually, who has power in this world? And there were a whole load of organizations that at the time nobody knew. Nobody knew what the G8 was. Nobody knew what the World Trade Organization was. Nobody knew what the World Bank was or the International Monetary Fund. And within the space of about 3 or 4 years, it went from nobody knows what they are to none of those institutions can meet anywhere in the world without being besieged by protesters. I mean, they had to go and find little islands, right, so that we couldn't get to them anymore. And it was the front page of the newspapers, and that was the anti-globalization movement. That was the movement that I learnt about politics through and in. So it was a very exciting time. But I know how powerful it can be to defeat something and make people feel we do have some power, and we can start exposing what's going on in the world. So I think that's possible, and I think we're winning on TTIP. But also, it's about closing down mines and power stations, and people all over Europe are doing this. There was an exciting action in Germany in the summer where people went to this. You were there, yeah? Where people went to this largest mine or something in Europe, yeah, with these enormous bulldozers that nobody could believe the size of these things.
I was thinking about
just
the G8,
machines.
but it was great.
Okay, yeah, that was good too. So, so there's a whole load of campaigns like this that we're used to working on, but I think they're getting stronger, much stronger. As time goes by. That's one thing. But the second thing is we need to start building the alternative. We need to start being positive. We can't just stop things. We've got to start building things. This sounds really, really hard. How on earth do we do this? But it's happening already. So we're working on something that we call energy democracy, which says, okay, yeah, we don't want any more fossil fuels, fine. We want renewables. But we also want to run our energy systems in fairer ways. In Britain now, there's a huge problem because a lot of poor, old people especially, have to choose in the winter, do I eat, do I cook my food, or do I heat my house? They can't afford to do both because our energy system is captured by big business that's making huge profits. So in Germany, what they said is, okay, we want to take over our energy systems, get big business out of the way, and the public will run energy systems, and they will be more sustainable, more renewable, and they will be fairer. And so there's a campaign, it has a horrible, horrible name called remunicipalization. But unlike the old form of nationalization, it's about the public literally running on a local level energy systems. And it hasn't worked everywhere. They've had referendums to take these energy systems over. In Berlin.
It's in Germany.
In Germany, yeah. But in some areas they're doing it, like Hamburg, they're doing it. And we're starting now in Britain to think about how we can do it. We've got a different political system, but we're starting to say schools can start producing their own renewable energy. And if schools do it, that creates pressure for a local authority to be forced to also start producing its own renewable energy and having control of that energy. We have one council now that's said it's doing this in Britain. So it's beginning, it's a start. People are starting to say, when we have democracy, when we have control, we can start to run things differently. We also have a food democracy movement called food sovereignty. I don't know if people have heard of food sovereignty. Okay, great. So this is a big movement all around the world. Peasant movements working on small farmers, growing organically, better for the environment, better for people. We're not just growing perfectly straight and beautiful carrots to send to Europe. We're growing carrots that we want to eat here in Africa, and it doesn't matter what shape they are. But also, I think this is starting, so I don't know if you have the same thing here, but in Britain now, there's a craze for people getting their vegetables delivered from local farms. Farmers markets are everywhere. And also people having allotments, like little bits of, in the city, little bits of land that you can grow vegetables on. This was thought of as something very boring and old-fashioned that old people did, and now there's lots of very cool young people who've got their allotments that they apparently go to at the weekend and grow their vegetables from. So this is another example of how people are saying we don't want our society to be controlled by big corporations. And they're small, they feel small. But that's where we've got to start. We've got to start building up something again from the bottom. So I hope that when we go to Paris, there's going to be a massive focus on alternatives. Well, there is, I know there is. There's going to be several days where we learn about how people are doing this in other places. So there's going to be a conference, a forum where we learn about how we pose things and big political analysis, and there's going to be a conference which is a showcase of alternatives from around the world. And so I hope you'll come. I hope you'll be part of it. If you can't be part of it for any reason, though, I think this is just going to be one moment where we inaugurate a newer, bigger movement, which goes into 2016, which we're all part of, and which isn't just about how many emissions and how many parts per whatever, you know, the science of it. Because I think people can get bored of it. I think it can go over people's heads. And I think also it's very scary. I mean, it's really scary. This is what Naomi Klein writes about in her book. I mean, you talk about climate change, and even I sometimes just want to go back to bed. I'm like, what's the point? This is awful. Actually, we need to put it in more hopeful and positive terms and say this is about building a new world, and that new world isn't going to mean we have nothing to eat and we're going back to the Dark Ages. It's going to mean we live very differently, but it's going to mean we replace some of the horrendous, isolating, alienating ideology that we've all grown up with something better, with a world that's fit for human beings in the 21st century, essentially. So I hope Paris is a really big staging post in that struggle, and I hope to see you all there.